Hello, Shadrak here. Today's video is Shadrak Presents the Havoc Talent Tree. I did make another video before this one going over the Demon Hunter side of the talent tree already, and that will be linked in the description and in the pinned comment, and in the near future I will be making one going over our hero talents as well, and same thing, those will be in the description and pinned comments. Without further ado, let's get to the Havoc talent tree. Now, it starts with I-Beam. You can't not talent into I-Beam, and I-Beam simply is normally a 40-second cooldown, costs 30 Fury to cast, and it's a channel. You can fully cancel this with other ability casts, and that's why I have a video up going over macros to make it so your abilities will not cancel I-Beam, as this is an incredible amount of your damage. I will be going over interactions with talents as well, and if it's talents further down in the tree, I'll get to them when it's time. So with I-Beam, this goes into Demonic, that's in the Demon Hunter tree. When you I-Beam, you also go into Demon form, which is the same as our cooldown Metamorphosis. Next, we have Critical Chaos. This talent is honestly extremely weak. The only situation we would ever talent it is if we didn't take Accelerated Blade, just so we had enough points to get through this gate. All it is 30% of your critical strike chance is added onto your chance to refund Fury from Chaos Strike. Without Critical Chaos, that is a 20% chance to refund 20 Fury, and with how much crit we usually have now, this would increase that to 32 to 35%. But we don't really have Fury issues, and for a full talent point, it is just incredibly low value. The only other reason that you would run through it is to get the talent below it, but I'll get to that in a moment. Next, we have a choice node between Insatiable Hunger and Demon Blades. Since we've got this talent tree, we've always run Demon Blades. We don't have the globals to not run Demon Blades, because this replaces Demon's Bite, which is our manually pressed builder. Insatiable Hunger makes that deal 50% more damage and generate an additional 5 to 10 Fury, but we just run Demon Blades as we also have Fellblade as a Fury generator, as well as Immolation Aura, Sigil of Flame, and Souls, plus other sources of Fury. We really don't need more, so we go with Demon Blades, the passive option, and this generates all the Fury that we need outside of our other globals. We have Burning Hatred, which makes Immolation Aura not just Fury on cast, but an additional 40 Fury over 10 seconds, so 4 Fury per second. And if you have multiple Immolation Auras up from talents further down in the tree, this Fury amount does stack. Next, we have a talent choice that typically you will never take this node, at least as it currently stands. We have Improved Fell Rush, which is just 20% increased damage on Fell Rush. Again, incredibly weak in value. And we have Dash of Chaos. This actually makes it so that after you Fell Rush, pressing it again will dash you back to your initial location where you cast Fell Rush from. Originally, this was designed as a way to make it easier to play Momentum if people wanted to play it, but have the playstyle be easier. As the movement builds don't really require you to press Fell Rush anymore, this talent doesn't really have a place in any way like that, and it's kind of janky, and again, because it costs you a whole talent point, no real situation we would ever run this. Below Critical Chaos, we have Improved Chaos Strike, and it's just Chaos Strike as well as Annihilation. The empowered version while you're in Metamorphosis deals 10% more damage. Any talent that references Chaos Strike or Blade Dance, it always buffs the empowered version as well. Next, we have First Blood. This empowers Blade Dance and Death Sweep to deal chaos damage. I believe this is 170%, it might even be more. Increased damage, and it converts it to chaos from physical. When it converts to chaos, that means because it's magic, it then pierces armor. And piercing armor is about a 40% damage buff as well, on top of the additional 170% that it's adding. So First Blood makes Blade Dance and Death Sweep do incredible amounts of damage on single target, specifically to your main target. It says the first target struck, which is if you press the button without a target, it will pick a target that takes that damage. Otherwise, the first target struck is always your target if they're in range. We have Accelerated Blade, and this just makes Throw Glaive deal increased damage. So it's 60% increased damage to your main target, and 30% reduced per enemy hit. This makes it so that Throw Glaive does more priority damage, and then bounces off to do less to other targets. And this does work as well with Reaver's Glaive. So Reaver's Glaive benefits from almost all of the Throw Glaive talents. There's one that it doesn't, which I'll get to in a moment. We have Demon Hide, which is simply a 3% magic damage increase. There's some bugs with Demon Hide where on a couple abilities in our kit, it applies multiple times for some reason that no one can really figure out. So it's a bit more than 3% that you would expect. But it's just a talent node that's always going to be taken because in our first gate, it is very good for its power. On top of that, it makes you take 5% reduced physical damage. Next, we have a choice node. This is between Desperate Instincts and Netherwalk. Typically, we take Netherwalk. However, if this is a button that you don't typically press, then you can run Desperate Instincts. And what Desperate Instincts does is Blur goes from a 20% to a 30% DR. And the downside to this talent, it's both an upside and a downside. For more casual players and people that are not as familiar with the classes, or doing content that's kind of on the lower end where things aren't one-shotty at all, and it's just you're taking damage, your healer has to keep up. Desperate Instincts is really good for that, because it triggers Blur with half cooldown and duration, so you'll get 5 seconds of Blur, being a 30% DR, for a 30-second cooldown. Whenever you fall below 35% health, that will happen if Blur is not on cooldown. In higher content, 10% DR on Blur would be nice, but the auto proc function in, say, high keys and mythic rating means this will proc all the time after you've already taken damage, and it kind of makes the talent unusable. So that's why Netherwalk is typically chosen, and Netherwalk simply increases movement speed by 100%. This actually increases your movement speed to 200%, and it'll do things like take away our move speed from our mastery, and it just lasts 6 seconds. You're unable to attack, except for that you can cast Sigil of Flame in Netherwalk. There's almost nothing that can be cast in it. You can't interrupt even, but you take 100% reduced damage. Now, I will note here, it states that you become immune to damage, not immune. You get all debuffs and anything that would otherwise kill you. Like, if you eat a mechanic that's going to give you a massive dot, think third boss in Workshop with the fire beams. If you Netherwalk and walk through a fire beam, you will get the dot, and when Netherwalk falls, that will still kill you in a tick or two. So Netherwalk is only useful as a DR, and for any mechanic that just does upfront damage. If it's based off of a debuff that's going to apply to you, Netherwalk will not prevent that. Next choice node, we have Deflecting Dance and Mortal Dance. Now, we almost always take Deflecting Dance in PvE content, and this is just, you deflect incoming attacks while blade dancing, absorbing damage up to 15% of your maximum health. Not all damage works into this. It's not simply just a 15% health shield. It only works on incoming direct damage. So if you have a dot on you, it will not count against the ticks of the dot. But if incoming damage is coming, think Swamp Face in Floodgate, the third boss. There's two different things doing damage to you on that fight. There's the dot that's applied to you when you're tethered to your partner, and Blade Dance doesn't work on that. And then there's the intermissions where he slams damage, and each slam where he shoots out the puddles does damage to you. Blade Dance works on those slams. This is typically how it works for almost any mechanic. Initial upfront damage hitting you, you can Blade Dance and get that extra 15% health, but dots it does not work on. Mortal Dance is just a Mortal Strike. It's an AoE Mortal Strike, so it's a bit unique, but it's 50% reduced healing received for 6 seconds. There might be some very niche scenarios that this gets run in PvE content, but in this current season, there isn't really any use cases. Next up, we have Initiative. Initiative has quite a bit to unpack, so let me dig into this. If you damage an enemy before they damage you, it increases your critical strike chance by 10%. As I mentioned earlier, when it says damaging you, this is also based off of direct incoming damage. It's very finicky what will and what will not stop you from proccing initiative. But we've had boss fights in the past, and Mythic Plus boss fights as well as raid bosses, where it's very inconsistent getting this buff because the way that their fight dot or anything like that deals damage to you counts as them damaging you directly. And then there's bosses where it's never an issue at all and you'll always be able to get it. The reason that matters is the second line. Pressing Vengeful Retreat refreshes your potential to trigger this effect on any enemies you're in combat with. So, after you've already procced it for the first time, you can't proc it again, but when you press Vengeful, that resets. But if you press Vengeful Retreat, and then you get hit by the enemy with a direct hit mechanic before you damage them, you won't get the buff, and you'll be unable to get the buff until you Vengeful Retreat again. This also does not work with Unhindered Assault in the Eldrazi tree. Evasive Action. The second cast of it does not reproc initiative. Next, we have Scars of Suffering. This is simple, increases versatility by 4% and reduces your threat generation by 8%. Very good for our threat problems, which are still a problem despite all the tank buffs. So we'll take it. And 4% versatility is almost just 4% damage and 2% DR, which is very good for a talent node in this area of the tree. You always take Scars of Suffering, and it would take a lot of changes to ever change that. It's just a very powerful talent. Our next talent is Chaotic Transformation, and this is whenever you cast Metamorphosis. And this is your cooldown Metamorphosis. This is not from casting I-Beam and getting your demon form that way. But whenever you cast Metamorphosis, the cooldown of Blade Dance and I-Beam are immediately reset. This is why our opener has a combo that includes casting I-Beam, using a Death Sweep, an Annihilation for your inner demon, casting Meta, and then both the Death Sweep and the I-Beam will be reset. Next, we have another Throw Glaive based talent, just like Accelerated Blade above, and we have a couple more down below. Furious Throws makes it so Throw Glaive costs 25 Fury instead of being free, but it also throws a second Glaive, so it just doubles the damage that it deals. And this has more interactions with talents below, which I'll get to later. Next, we have Trail of Ruin. This is simply just a dot that's dealt to all enemies after your Blade Dance. The final slash, every mob that gets hit by it will get Trail of Ruin applied, and this is purely uncapped because it's a single dot being applied to each mob. It's not incredibly strong, but it's the only way to get down to Immolation Aura talents, and typically we always take it, although there is some niche builds that can pop up where on pure single target it can be dropped if you also drop Deflecting Dance, but you lose survivability to gain 2 talent points elsewhere. Next, under Initiative, we have Tactical Retreat. Now, Tactical Retreat takes the cooldown of Vengeful Retreat and reduces it by 5 seconds. That takes it from 25 to 20 seconds, and it also makes it generate 80 Fury over 10 seconds. So 8 Fury per second. If it's being pressed on cooldown, you have about 50% uptime on that, which smooths out our Fury generation in raid builds. And it makes Vengeful Retreat line up, because a 25-second cooldown doesn't line up to really anything in our kit, but a 20-second does. With Cycle of Hatred, which I'll get to later, I-Beam is on a 20-second, Essence Break's on a 40, and it just fits our burst windows, both to get the initiative buff, as well as the buff below that. We have Blind Fury, and Blind Fury is per point. It makes it so I-Beam generates Fury per second, and increases the damage and duration of I-Beam. This previously used to just be duration, not damage, but it was changed to be 20% damage and duration, so that I-Beam itself is a little bit shorter, whereas old Blind Fury I-Beam used to be a very lengthy cast. So this takes it from the base 10 ticks that it deals up to 12, and with the 40 Fury generated every second, You generate around 100 Fury from I-Beam. It does still cost 30 to cast, but then you generate back while you're casting that. This is incredibly good in AoE builds, or any kind of cleave scenario. I-Beam does a large amount of our overall damage, so in Mythic Plus specifically, that is always taken. Another I-Beam talent right beside that is Looks Can Kill, and that makes it so I-Beam always critically strikes. This doesn't have any other interactions with our kit anywhere. It's just every single hit will crit, and it does devalue critical strike slightly, but again, because I-Beam does so much damage, this is a very good talent to take in pretty much every scenario. Next, we have Dancing with Fate. Now, this is for both Blade Dance and Death Sweep, and the way that it works is on 2 talent points. The final slash of Blade Dance and Death Sweep, it deals an additional 50% damage. The reason this talent is not really that good is the final slash of Blade Dance and Death Sweep, it's the final of 4 slashes, and the last slash does the equivalent damage of the first 3 slashes. So, if you think about that, where the final slash is exactly half of the damage, and then you're buffing that by half, it's a 25% damage increase to Death Sweep and Blade Dance. This isn't that competitive per talent point. That's really not much DPS gain, and there's just other options that are better. As well as that, you don't really need it to get around the tree at all, except for in single target. But in AoE scenarios, because you're going to go down through Immolation Aura talents, you can just skip right around it to talent into everything else that you need below. Speaking of Immolation Aura talents, we have Growing Inferno, and this makes it so Immolation Aura's damage is increased by 10% each time it deals damage. Now, as far as I understand, this still doesn't work the way it says. It did work this way once upon a time when it was a conduit back in Shadowlands, and at some point it got broken. Whether or not Immolation Aura deals damage, every tick of Immolation Aura will deal 10% more damage. So even if you have to move off a mob and it doesn't tick a couple times, when you go back on, it will deal increased damage based on whatever tick number it is. So like, let's say you hit the first and second tick and it's doing 20% more, you leave for 2 ticks, and then you come back and the 5th tick hits, it won't do 30% more damage, it will do 50% more. So it's not just for dealing damage, it's just 10% extra damage per tick. Next, we have Exergy and Inertia. This is a choice node, and this is typically only run in Raid. Exergy makes it so Hunt and Vengeful Retreat increase your damage by 5% for 20 seconds. This has a cap of 30 seconds on the buff, so if you cast Hunt, and then a couple seconds later you cast Vengeful Retreat, you won't go up to, say, 38 seconds, you'll go to 30. As well as that, this talent has a very short internal cooldown, so if you cast Hunt and Vengeful Retreat instantly out of it, because Vengeful's not on the global cooldown, it will not give you one of your Exergy buffs, and you'll only get a 20-second buff. So you want to avoid ever casting Vengeful Retreat directly after casting the Hunt, because you will not get that buff. Inertia is the other choice, and this one's a bit more burst-based, and the Hunt Vengeful Retreat will cause your next Fell Rush or Fell Blade to empower you, increasing your damage by 18% for 5 seconds. This is really awkward because Vengeful Retreat now locks you out of casting Fell Rush and Fell Blade for a second, so you end up in a scenario where you can't line up Inertia onto your initiative windows perfectly anymore, and it's part of why I dislike Inertia in the rework, though it is competitive and can be played in Raid. Our next talent point is Isolated Prey. This was previously a PvP talent, and I still really hate this design for PvE, but Chaos Nova, which is our AoE stun, I-Beam, and Immolation Aura gain bonuses when striking one target. For Chaos Nova, it stuns for an increased 2 seconds, so it goes from a 2-second stun to 4 seconds. You basically never have a single target that you're going to be stunning that this is useful on, so in PvE that's basically just not relevant. For I-Beam, it's 30% increased damage, which is too small to be worth taking in pure single target, unless you're specifically avoiding taking talents for movement. In no mover builds, we will run through Isolated Prey just because you gotta put your talent points somewhere, and you drop 3 talent points on the left side. And Immolation Aura always critically strikes. The problem is, in single target scenarios, you do not run Immolation Aura talents, and it does basically 0 damage. And even if you have all your Immolation Aura talents and you take Isolated Prey, we have very high crit chance on Immolation Aura anyways. So it doesn't benefit that greatly, and it doesn't make Immolation Aura like pop off on single target. If it had instead been like Immolation Aura does 100% more damage, this would have been much more competitive, but it's very weak as is. That's why we typically always avoid Isolated Prey. Next, we have another I-Beam talent, and this is Furious Gaze, which is when I-Beam finishes fully channeling, your haste is increased by an additional 10% for 10 seconds. Like all haste buffs in WoW, this is multiplicative, so if you have 30% haste when this procs, it will take you to 43% haste, not to 40. It increases both your base 100% by 10% and any haste that you already have by another 10%. You do have to finish channeling I-Beam. If you cancel I-Beam, either by not having macros set up to not cancel it, or if you need to cancel it early just to move or something, you do not get this buff, and you will just entirely not be making use of this talent point. So that's something to be aware of. It also doesn't stack on itself, so if you do I-Beam meta and then I-Beam again, it'll just go back to 10 seconds. It won't go up to like 15 or something like that. Next, we have Serrated Glaive. This kind of seems like a throw glaive talent, but honestly, this is just a passive talent that you do not think about in any scenario ever. Enemies hit by your Chaos Strike or Throw Glaive take 15% increased damage from Chaos Strike and Throw Glaive for 15 seconds. This also applies to Annihilation as well as Chaos Strike, and this also applies to Reaver's Glaive as well as Throw Glaive. Now, because of other interactions and everything, this is just always up. No matter what, you're always going to have this buff up, and in AoE scenarios, you're probably going to have it on basically every single target. You don't think about or track this in any way. Don't worry about the uptime on it or anything. Serrated Glaive just plays itself. We have Burning Wound, and this is Demon Blades and Throw Glaive leave an open wound on enemies, dealing a small dot of chaos damage, and increases the damage taken from your Immolation Aura by 40%. However, it can only be on 3 targets at once. Again, because Throw Glaive is so integral to the rotation, and as I'll mention below, it's automatically thrown by Blade Dance, these are always dealt with on their own. This is why on Felskart, though, I specifically mentioned that it's good to enter a pull pressing Blade Dance, just like as Alterachi, you want to enter a pull throwing a Reaver's Glaive, because then your Burning Wounds will be placed out, and Demon Blades will manually put it on your main target that you're hitting anyway. So you'll always have your 3 Burning Wounds out, and that'll just make your Immolation Auras do more damage. Next, we have Unbound Chaos. This talent was supposed to be 500%, but it released at 300, and it's not competitive at all at the current numbers, so we don't ever take this, but what it does is the Hunt and Vengeful Retreat increase the damage of your next Fell Rush or Fell Blade by 300%. That is the same way that you proc Inertia, is Unbound Chaos, and 300% is not enough to be competitive. Even if it had been released at the 500% it was announced as, I don't think we would ever run this talent point. It also only lasts 12 seconds, unlike Inertia, so you get put on a time limit to use it, and it's just a pretty weak point in general, considering it is in our bottom gate, so you can't use it with the points that are up here. This is in, the section up down below. Okay, next we have a choice node, and we don't run either of these talents currently. We have Chaos Theory, and that's Blade Dance causes your next Chaos Strike within 8 seconds to have increased critical strike chance. It's RNG between 14 to 30%, so when you Blade Dance, the buff will show what percent it is. and it will always refund Fury. Again, we don't really need Fury, so that part of it's pretty dead right now, where in the past that has carried it. And the increased critical strike chance from Chaos Theory seems like something that would work with Know Your Enemy, which I will be getting to in a second, but it doesn't. It doesn't actually increase your critical strike chance, it just increases the chance that Chaos Strike will critically strike. So it doesn't have good interactions, and it just doesn't really provide good damage at all for the point. The other talent, while Chaos Theory is a pure single target talent, Glaive Tempest is an AoE focused talent. And this drops two glaives on the this drops two glaives on the ground that just spin and do damage. It says it's over 3 seconds, but it's actually hasted. So if you're like in Metamorphosis, it'll deal it over like 2 seconds. It doesn't do more damage from doing haste, it just does the damage faster, which isn't really useful. And it does have a hasted cooldown. So it's a 25-second cooldown, but the more haste you have, the lower that cooldown will go. So you'll see here if I I-beam and I get my Furious Gaze, that'll drop to 17 seconds. The problem is it's not tuned that well, so it's pretty decent on AoE. It deals reduced damage going beyond 8 targets, but because of how weak it's tuned right now, on single target, it's almost a net loss to press. So if you do talent into it in like a Mythic Plus scenario, you're not going to want to press it on bosses, which leaves it as a really weak talent point because it doesn't do enough on AoE to justify running. Our next choice node is Inner Demon and Restless Hunter. Inner Demon is the one that we always take, it's just the better tuned one. And that's anytime you enter Demon form, it causes your next Chaos Strike or Annihilation to unleash your Inner Demon, causing it to crash into your target and deal 500,000 Chaos damage to all nearby enemies. And it deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets. Now, with Inner Demon, it says it launches at your enemy, but it actually just launches in front of where you were when you press the Chaos Strike, and if your target is moving, it can actually miss. It's also not got the best hitbox, so in AoE, it'll miss some of the mobs pretty often. However, we have I-Beam every 20 seconds now, so you get an Inner Demon every 20 seconds, and you also get it refreshed when you press Metamorphosis, even if you're currently in Demon form, and again if you press I-Beam while you're already in Metamorphosis. So that's why in our opener, we do I-Beam, Annihilation, Death Sweep, Meta, Death Sweep, Annihilation, I-Beam. Those 2 Annihilations are to use those 2 Inner Demons before we would overrate the buff. Because if you already have the Inner Demon buff and you press Meta or you press I-Beam again, it will simply replace the buff and you'll just lose that Inner Demon. You won't be able to use it. The choice that we don't take is Restless Hunter, and that's when you leave Demon form, it grants you a charge of Fell Rush and increases the damage of your next Blade Dance by 50%. It's just not really tuned that well, and with how long our Metamorphosis is because of 20-second I-Beam and in raid builds with Shattered Destiny, you can go like a minute without leaving Demon form, and Blade Dance doesn't do good AoE damage, it does good single target only, so it's really a single target talent, and it just doesn't kind of work with the current design of Havoc. Our next choice node is Relentless Onslaught, which used to be run a lot, and it's just Chaos Strike has a 10% chance to trigger another Chaos Strike. This is also same thing, it works for Annihilation to proc another Annihilation. You can kind of think of it as 10% more damage out of Chaos Strike. So much like Improved Chaos Strike above, just 10% more damage. The talent that we currently always run is Soulscar, and this is Rogue Glaive causes targets to take 80% of the damage dealt as chaos damage over 6 seconds. I get asked about Soulscar a lot, and I do want to explain this right. It doesn't matter. Maintaining Soulscar is not what you're aiming to do. It doesn't matter at all. Soulscar works like Ignite does for Fire Mage or other accumulator effects, where any damage that Throw Glaive deals is basically put into a pool. So if you throw a Glaive and it does 100,000 damage, then 80% of that goes and is converted to be dealt as chaos damage. Your mastery then scales on it, so that 80%, let's say you have 100% mastery for sake of argument, that will then go up as 160% damage, and it will do 160,000 damage over 6 seconds. If you then throw a second glaive, and your soul scar ticks before your second glaive hits. It'll take that 160,000 damage you have. A third of it will be put out because it ticks every 2 seconds. So that 160,000 damage, about 53,000 of it will come out. So let's say you have 107,000 damage. You throw another glaive that does the same amount. It will now add to the new amount. Let's say it's 160,000 again. It will add that to the 107k. So now it will be doing 267,000 damage over 6 seconds. So every time a new glaive hits, it will just recalculate and add it back to the pool and then have the dot happening again. The reason I mention this is I get asked often, like, should I worry about soul scar uptime? Like, I only have it up like 50% of the time. It just does damage based on the damage dealt by throw glaives. When it does damage doesn't matter at all. The more throw glaive damage you deal, the more damage soul scar does. It doesn't have to be over any duration or anything like that. There's no interaction with this that you want to think about at all. You shouldn't even track it on your target. This is, however, an incredibly powerful talent point with throw glaive and especially reverse glaive with Eldrachi, because it does work with that as well. This does a lot of our overall damage, both in single target and cleave scenarios, because of Screaming Brutality below, that I will get to soon. Next, we have another Immolation Aura talent. This one's only ever taken in AoE, just like the other Immolation Aura talents, and this is a large reason why Immolation Aura does so much damage in Mythic Plus. This is Ragefire. What Ragefire does is every time Immolation Aura deals damage, 30% of that damage dealt each time Immolation Aura deals critical damage, so if it's a critical strike, 30% of that damage dealt is gathered as Ragefire damage. However, this is limited to up to 3 critical strikes per tick. So that's every single time it does damage, every second. If you hit 3 mobs and all 3 of them crit, then 30% of each hit will be put into the amount. If you press Immora on 20 targets and you crit on 10 of them, 3 of the random ones are chosen. It's not the highest 3 or any metric to it. Well, we've been told that it's just randomized. 3 of the critical strikes will be gathered as Ragefire and put into the pool, but only 3. The reason that's important is Immolation Aura deals reduced damage over 8 targets. So, up to 8 targets, your Ragefires typically will be getting bigger and bigger, so you'll more consistently get your maximum of 3 crits per tick. And then over 8 targets, Ragefire damage starts to come down, because Immolation Aura damage lowers, but your critical strike chance on Immora is high enough that it's pretty much saturated and you'll always get those 3 crits. However, Ragefire itself does uncapped damage. So even if your Immolation Aura damage comes down, and on 20 targets compared to 8 targets, it's going to do about half the damage, which means if you would have a 3 million Ragefire on 8 target, you'll probably have about 1.5 million on 20 target. But every single target that is in range when your Immolation Aura expires will be hit by Ragefire for that full amount. So that 1.5 million that you stored up will do 30 million across the 20 targets, whereas the 3 million Ragefire you stored up on 8 targets will do 3 million per and total 24 mil. So Ragefire is better in higher target counts, but it doesn't continue to do a higher amount per hit. It can be a bit convoluted to explain. There's also some other interactions because our maximum of 3 burning wounds. It's just unfortunate that it does not take the biggest critical strikes, because it would keep it better in a lot of scenarios. Okay, next is the crux of our scaling and why we stack critical strike. You gain critical strike damage equal to 80% of your critical strike chance. What that means is I have 38% critical strike chance. 80% of that is about 30%. So think of it as going from 200% critical strike damage, which is the base in the game. You deal double damage if you crit. With Know Your Enemy, you're going to go up to about 230% critical strike chance or damage. So the more critical strike chance you have, the more damage those crits also do. This applies as well to external effects. So this works on trinkets. This is why with, for example, the magnet trinket, this patch, I have that weak aura that glows based on your amount of crit that you have, because both a higher crit chance, so it's going to crit more often, and it will do more damage when it does crit. And as I mentioned earlier, this doesn't have interaction with Chaos Theory, so while you'll crit more often, it doesn't increase the critical strike damage further. Same with Looks Can Kill. I-Beam will always crit, and it will do that, 230%-ish critical strike damage per hit, but this doesn't increase it anymore by making it 100% critical strike chance. It won't give it 80% critical strike damage as well. There's no interactions like that. Next, we have Cycle of Hatred. This is one of our most important talents, and there's some nuance to this one. So, activating I-Beam, which just means casting I-Beam, reduces the cooldown of your next I-Beam by 5 seconds, stacking up to 20 seconds. You always start with 1 stack, which means if I press I-Beam, instead of having a 40-second cooldown, you'll see that when I press it here, it goes to 35. And I can press meta to reset it. I have 2 stacks. If I press it again, it'll be 30. This goes all the way to bringing it down to 20 seconds, which takes 3 casts of I-Beam, and after the 3rd cast, every following cast from there will be a 20-second cooldown. It doesn't reset, but if you are out of combat for 1 minute without having cast I-Beam, your Cycle of Hatred stacks will drop. That also includes if you're dead, you're out of combat, so if you're dead for more than a minute, say on a raid fight, you're dead for over a minute, then you get rezzed, your Cycle of Hatred stacks will have reset. This does not reset on boss pull or on a key starting, which means you can be I-beaming as you enter a key or prior to a boss pull to have your stacks ready so that you have a 20-second cooldown on I-beam when the dungeon or when the raid boss encounter starts. And in raid, because it doesn't drop instantly when you die, if your raid wipes, you get rezzed, and then you generate Fury and press I-beam right away, you will actually be able to keep your Cycle of Hatred stacks, and every time you press I-beam, it will last for another 60 seconds out of combat. In Mythic Plus, this typically never drops. The only scenario that is really ever an issue is some weird skip issues, or the minecart in Dark Flame Cleft. You need to press I-beam right before you hop on the cart, or you can actually open your spellbook while you're on the cart and manually press it there, just to continue with stacks so that they don't fall. So again, the nuance to this is just the fact that you can have it pre-stacked going into raid encounters and Mythic Plus. However, changing your zone will reset it, so when you walk into a dungeon, you lose your stacks. You can only stack it once you've walked inside. Next, our talent is Chaotic Disposition. This is really just a interesting way of aura buffing us. Your chaos damage has a 7.77% chance to be increased by 17%, and this is rolled 7 times. So every single event of chaos damage that we deal gets 7 rolls on a 1 in 13 chance to deal 17% more damage, and this will stack. So if all 7 of these successfully did roll, which is an incredibly low odd that I don't even want to calculate right now, it'll never actually happen, but you would get 7 different 17% increases on it. Math-wise, this just works out to be something around, I believe it's an 8% damage increase. And the first talent point gives you 3 rolls, and the second one actually adds 4, taking you from 3 to 7, because it's an odd number. So the second point in Chaotic Disposition is 33% more valuable than the first, which is actually why we prefer to take this over Essence Breaking Keys, because dropping that point is pretty costly. Next, we have a Fire Inside. This is our Immolation Aura talent that makes Immolation Aura really work. So instead of Immolation Aura just being a single charge, it takes it to a 2-charge system, which means you don't have to press it literally on cooldown, you just don't want to overcap with it, and it gives you a lot more freedom and wiggle room to move it around where you want it, and you have a 30% chance per cast for it to refund a charge. When that charge is refunded, there is a couple things to note. There's a limit to how many immolation auras you can have on you. Now, if you look at my buffs here, you'll see that I have them pop up down here and up top. These all have different spell IDs. And there is a limited amount of spell IDs. Both between those and between Consuming Fire, which is part of the Eldrazi tree, where Immolation Aura is buffed by Felskard and does 30% more damage. They have some shared IDs, and there's some complications to it. Basically, the way that it works, as I understand it, is you have a maximum of 5 Immolation Auras that you can have on you at a time. However, when Consuming Fire is brought into the mix, this gets a bit weird. You can't have more than 4 Consuming Fires on you. And if one of the Immolation Auras on you is not this initial ID, the 258920, then when you're pressing Consuming Fires, same thing, you can only have 4 on you. If this initial cast is on you, then you can have up to 5, including Consuming Fires. What happens if you press an extra stack? Basically, this is just on Eldrazi, or outside of Metamorphosis windows and Felskard, you need incredible amounts of luck to get 6 Immolation Auras in a row. But if you do hit a 6th one, what will happen is it will queue it up to cast itself after one of the other ones drops. However, if you cast I-Beam will instantly cancel and not deal damage. It's very janky. The interaction and bug is incredibly weird, but it's important to note, especially if you're playing Felskard, because you want to make sure that you don't go over your cap of Immolation Auras and Consuming Fires, as you will not be able to press your Abyssal Gaze on Felskard. It will just cancel. As well as the charge system and the refund, as I mentioned, it does convert it from being fire damage to chaos damage, and that means our mastery scales it. We have a lot of mastery. As you can see right now, I have 80%, so it just does 80% more damage. As well as that, because it gets converted to chaos, that means chaotic disposition works on it. That's about another 8% damage going into it, and it's just what really makes it incredibly strong. I will note, Rage Fire, it will still deal fire damage instead of chaos, but that doesn't matter. Rage Fire isn't buffed by anything, but because you're buffing Immolation Aura's damage, and Immolation Aura does 80% more damage, that means every tick that builds into Rage Fire is 80% stronger. So even though Rage Fire is not directly buffed by the talent, all the damage that builds into it is. So that means Rage Fire also, by proxy, scales off of Mastery as well. I mentioned this as I have had questions as to why Mastery is recommended when so much of our damage is fire. It really just is the case that there's some interactions where behind the scenes, if you don't know how they work, it means Mastery scaling is still incredibly good. We have Essence Break. This is typically only run in raids. It's not good in Mythic Plus, but Essence Break is a 40-second cooldown, so you can line it up with every second I-Beam, and you slash all enemies in a small cone in front of you for some chaos damage, and it increases the damage of only your Chaos Strike and Blade Dance. That's as well as Annihilation and Death Sweep, their empowered versions, and they will deal 80% more damage for 4 seconds. This does not buff all of your damage, it only buffs Blade Dance and Chaos Strike. This is one of the number one things that I hear misinformation on, is a misunderstanding where people think this is just an 80% damage buff, and it's not. It is only those buttons, and that is why when Essence Break is used, it is after other buttons are pressed, after I-Beam, so we're in Metamorphosis, where Annihilation and Death Sweep do 30% more damage than Chaos Strike and Blade Dance, and then those will be buffed by 80%. And that's also why it's used with Metamorphosis, as Death Sweep is a stronger button than Annihilation by a lot, so you Essence Break, Death Sweep, Meta, Death Sweep, to get 2 Death Sweeps in that 4-second window, so they deal 80% more damage. I will note, Essence Break's cone is very small, it has a really bad hitbox, and it can miss. It also can be parried, so if you hit a boss from in front, Essence Break can be parried, and your debuff won't apply as well as the damage won't apply. So you definitely don't want to be in front of a boss when you press Essence Break. That's something important to keep in mind. We have Shattered Destiny. This is a raid-only talent. It's really bad in Mythic Plus. It can sim decently, but we have too much forced downtime and too many utility globals used to ever make proper use of this compared to sims. But your active demon form, whether this is from Demonic, from casting Eyebeam, or from pressing Metamorphosis, is extended by 0.1 seconds per 12 Fury spent. That means a Blade Dance, which costs 35, will give you 0.3 of a second, and Chaos Strike will also give you 0.3 of a second, sometimes 0.4. This is relatively minor. It goes a little bit of a way to extending it, but after multiple nerfs, it's just a small increase on Metamorphosis, which is mostly a single target cooldown, and it's just kind of ran as there isn't better options in Raid. Because you're not running Immolation or talents, you don't take a Fire Inside. Unbound Chaos is really weak. Chaos Theory is really weak. And yeah. So it's a defaulted Raid option, but I don't recommend it outside of that anywhere else. It's not particularly strong. Next, we have Screaming Brutality. This is our newest talent point, and this was previously our tier set in Season 3 and 4 of Dragonflight. And it makes it so Blade Dance automatically triggers Throw Glaive on your primary target for 100% damage. And each slash has a 50% chance to throw Glaive an enemy for 35% damage. That is each slash of your Blade Dance, so 4 different rolls of 50% chance, which means you get anywhere from 0 to 4 additional Glaives doing 1/3 damage. There's a lot of things to note about this. One, it will actually cast Throw Glaive for you. If you're talented into Furious Throws, this means it will throw a second Glaive, not just a single one. Why that is important is, unlike Furious Throws itself, where it costs you 25 Fury to cast this Throw Glaive, it casts it for free, and it doesn't incur global cooldown. But you do need to have a charge of Throw Glaive for it to actually throw it. So you'll see here, when I press Blade Dance, my stat count on the bottom here will go from 2 to 1, and the cooldown comes back. Now, I can sit here and I can throw a Glaive, and I can throw another Glaive, and when I Blade Dance, it will throw the mini 1/3 damage Glaives, but it will not do the 100% damage Glaive throw. Because I didn't have a charge, it won't happen. This is why we do not manually throw Glaive in the rotation at all, because Screaming Brutality uses pretty much all the throw Glaives that we ever could use. Blade Dance is a 10-second cooldown, Throw Glaive is a 9-second cooldown, both are hasted, and Death Sweep is actually also a 9-second cooldown, so Death Sweep has the same cooldown as Throw Glaive. As well as that, because Metamorphosis resets Death Sweep, on pull or any time that we use Metamorphosis, we will be throwing both of the Glaive charges from the double Death Sweeps that are used. This is why Soul Scar is such an incredible amount of our damage, and why if I look at a key, you're going to see Soul Scars exceptionally high, because we throw so many Glaives from this, and there's some other interactions between, hero talent trees, but in Raid, for Eldrachi, you always run this because all the Throw Glaive talents benefit Reaver's Glaive, and it's just really good synergy. In Mythic Plus, typically we take this for a lot of reasons, and just to go over some of the interactions, while some of the talent points are pretty weak, altogether bringing Accelerated Blade, Furious Throws, Screaming Brutality, and Soul Scar together means that Blade Dance becomes a much more powerful button, and on lower cleave amounts, like 1 to 3 targets, it does a lot of passive damage. As well as that, it manually applies your burning wounds when you press Blade Dance, whereas otherwise you would have to tab target and keep 3 out on your own, or you'd have to throw Glaive in your rotation without having the talents, which is more or less a dead global. So having Screaming Brutality for Fellscarred builds in Mythic Plus, and for Eldrachi itself, means Burning Wound is always dealt with automatically. You don't have to think about it as long as you're doing your rotation correctly. It's already being done. That's also why Serrated Glaive is typically on every single target, because those bounces go everywhere from Screaming Brutality, so it's all just covered. Last, we have Fell Barrage. Now, Fell Barrage is not as strong as it used to be, and it's been changed a few times. But the version it's currently landed on is unfortunately very weak. But it costs 10 Fury to cast, and then it says you unleash a torrent of fell energy, rapidly consuming Fury to inflict 80,000 chaos damage to all enemies within 12 yards, lasting 8 seconds or until Fury is depleted. The way that this works specifically is it ticks 4 times per second. It's not hasted, so haste doesn't interact with this in any way. And it consumes 8 Fury per tick. So it takes 32 Fury per second for up to 8 seconds, which totals 256 Fury over the duration. So not only are you limited on the Fury that you can really spend in that window, it's limited at 8 seconds, you can't extend it further. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown, so it doesn't line up well to Metamorphosis. And it's a loss to cast in single target because it costs so much Fury and the damage is balanced around AoE. However, unlike most of our AoE and Glaive Tempest, which are, set up to do reduced damage beyond 8 targets, Full Barrage also does reduce damage beyond 5 targets. So it doesn't excel in large AoE either. It just is kind of weak. The strongest point that it could be at is like a 5 to 6 target pull, and it doesn't excel in those scenarios either. That's why we don't currently run this in Mythic Plus at any time. It kind of had a time and place last season with Transmitter because with that, Inertia, the sigil of our Student of Suffering sigil mastery, you could overlap like really big windows and get a good bit of burst into it where it was doing almost double damage, and even that barely made it work. As of right now, with the current design, Fell Barrage is kind of just a dead talent point, which is unfortunate because it's kind of fun to play with. So, that covers everything in the Havoc talent tree. This ended up being a lot longer than I expected it to take, honestly. My voice is dead after 50 minutes, so thank you for anyone that's watched this whole video. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and hopefully you have a better understanding of Havoc as a class now. Thank you for watching. Please leave a like and a subscribe if you do like this kind of content and my channel, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good day.